we go. Okay. All right. So today, the Arctic is a region of extremes. It deals with extreme seasonal shifts in daylight, extreme cold, and extreme winds. Winter temperatures can reach average lows of -40 degrees Celsius. And because of its polar location and the tilt of the Earth, the Arctic will typically experience about 4 months of continuous winter darkness. So seemingly, from an outside perspective, it should be unfit for life. But we know that's not true, right? The Arctic is home to a unique ecosystem made up of organisms that are adapted to endure those extreme Arctic conditions. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet and is home to polar, grizzly, and black bears, 8 different species of marine mammal, gigantic herds of caribou, wolves, muskoxen, moose, and so much more. Polar bears build their dens there. The caribou use the coastal plains to breed, and migrating birds come from all over to build their nests. In fact, over 200 species of bird depend on Arctic ecosystems for nesting. Some species, including the Svalbard rock ptarmigan, are year-round residents and are uniquely adapted to endure those harsh winter conditions. And they utilize some very cute strategies to keep themselves warm in the winter and will actually dig themselves these little snow dens to use for shelter. But the majority of polar birds actually choose to avoid these winter conditions by migrating to lower latitudes following the end of the breeding season. And some birds actually take this to an extreme, and some Arctic tern individuals will migrate 80,000 kilometers round trip annually between Antarctica and the Arctic, the equivalent of 3 round trips to the moon and back over the course of a life. And they're taking advantage of a year-round polar summer in doing that. Neither of these strategies, overwintering or migrating, seems particularly practical, right? As they both require a suite of adaptations, which may prompt some of you to ask, okay, if you're a bird and you can fly, why are you bothering with Arctic ecosystems at all? Polar birds preferentially nest in these challenging environments to take advantage of seasonally abundant food resources, including growing plants, increased insect biomass, and increased fish populations that are benefiting from seasonal zooplankton blooms. And this richness is fueled by a high latitude summer light regime with up to 6 months of continuous summer daylight. While the majority of these polar birds spend only the breeding season actually in their polar environments, they really are vitally important members of their ecosystems because they aid in crucial tasks like pollination and seed dispersal and insect and small mammal population control. In fact, it's been hypothesized that over deep time, birds aided in structuring modern polar ecosystems by helping small organisms like insects and plants disperse over long distances to actually be able to colonize those polar regions. So understanding modern polar ecosystem structure really depends on understanding when birds began utilizing polar ecosystems for nesting. Unfortunately, it's not that easy because polar regions are undersampled relative to lower latitude regions. And that's in large part thanks to inaccessible bedrock across most of the poles. And extremely logistically challenging, dangerous, and expensive field conditions. This bias against polar fossils makes our question, when did birds begin utilizing Arctic ecosystems for nesting, insanely difficult to answer. And not only that, but birds are already some of the rarest fossils in the world because they have very small and fragile bones, making them difficult to fossilize. And before we get into how we're going to solve this problem, I want to take a quick detour to talk briefly about the evolutionary history of birds. So Archaeopteryx was first discovered in 1861 in Germany, and it's still considered the earliest true bird. Up until its discovery, the general consensus was that birds didn't evolve until sometime in the Eocene period, about 55 million years ago. And Charles Darwin himself remarked upon the significance of the discovery of Archaeopteryx in his 4th edition of On the Origin of Species, saying that strange bird, the Archaeopteryx, with a long lizard-like tail bearing a pair of feathers on each joint, and with its wings furnished with 2 free claws, has been discovered. Hardly any recent discovery shows more forcibly how little we as yet know of the former inhabitants of the world. So it's a very important discovery. Even though we have a good idea of what those first birds looked like, bird fossils are still relatively rare. And the rarity of bird fossils is in large part, like I mentioned, due to fossil record biases related to the small size and delicate build of the bird skeleton. So with the exception of key localities with exceptional preservational conditions, birds really are some of the rarest Mesozoic fossils. And this is especially true in the late Cretaceous, where with the exception of members of a few toothed bird groups, the record's really limited to partial isolated elements. And for those of you who don't know, when I'm talking about toothed birds, these aren't the same as the teeth that you might be familiar with of ducks and geese, because these are made out of keratin, so the same stuff as your fingernails, rather than bone, so they don't count as true teeth. Birds with true teeth went extinct in the end Cretaceous mass extinction, which is something we should be very grateful for, because that goose bite would hurt a lot more. So there are two toothed birds from Kansas that very much shaped early bird paleontology, and they were first described by Othniel Charles Marsh in the late 1800s. And when they were first described, Darwin wrote him a letter and said, "These birds are the most convincing evidence for evolution since I wrote on the origin of species." So very high praise. And members of the public actually tried to persuade Marsh to hide the specimens because they were just too controversial and convincing of evolution. And even after evolution became widely accepted, members of the public still didn't like it, and Marsh was accused of faking specimens by putting reptilian jaws on bird skeletons. And part of the reason for this extreme response is because these birds basically look like modern birds, just with teeth. If we look at Archaeopteryx compared to our pigeon, it doesn't look quite like a bird yet. There are still some things that make it look a lot like a dinosaur. It's got a long tail. It still has fingers with claws instead of kind of this silly little wing. And the pigeon has this huge keel on its sternum for where the flight muscles attach, and that's not really present yet in Archaeopteryx. But now if we look at Ichthyornis next to our pigeon, they're going to start looking very similar. We have the short tail, we've got the wing with just kind of this one silly little finger and no claw, and we have that sternum with the big keel on it. So superficially, really, the only major difference is that long beak with lots of sharp, pointy teeth in Ichthyornis. So by the late Cretaceous, there are really only a few major groups of birds present. We have Enantiornithes, which is this weird group of birds that split from Euornithes, or the lineage that includes all modern birds, in the early Cretaceous. And this is generally considered the more abundant group of Mesozoic birds, and they make up over half of all described Mesozoic bird species. But their late Cretaceous record is still relatively poor compared to the early Cretaceous record. The really nice thing about Enantiornithines is because their skeletons are so weird, they're generally very easy to identify. And they're weird because there's just a lot of things about their skeletons that are opposite from the birds that we have now. So much so that their name literally means opposite bird. We have Ichthyornithes, and this is a group which only contains two species. We have Ichthyornis and Janavis, which is this guy up here. Ichthyornis was one of those first fossil birds described by Marsh, and Janavis was actually just named a few years ago, so it's kind of a silly group. And they're generally thought of as having a gull-like ecology. And then we have Hesperornithes, which are these super weird large diving birds. So they can get up to 6 feet long and can kind of just be thought as like oversized loons. Generally, Hesperornithes and Ichthyornithes are thought of as shorebirds, whereas Enantiornithes are considered the predominant land birds of the Mesozoic. And the last group of birds I want to talk about that's hanging around in the late Cretaceous are members of Neornithes, or the avian crown. So this group first emerged sometime in the Cretaceous, but didn't radiate until after the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And as of now, there are only two unambiguous crown birds from the Mesozoic. We have Vegavith, which is this guy here from Antarctica, and Asteriornis from Belgium. And they're both known from highly complete skeletons and skulls, and they're both from the very latest Cretaceous. Outside of these two species, there's been a lot of efforts to identify crown birds in the Cretaceous, but it's been highly contentious because the referrals have generally been based on single isolated bones. So when we're looking at late Cretaceous birds, we really have members of Enantiornithes, Ichthyornithes, Hesperornithes, or crown birds. There's one weird bird, because of course there always has to be a weird bird, called Iaciornis, and that's the most commonly recovered sister to the avian crown. And it's been hard to place just because it has a kind of a weird mix of features that's made it just very difficult to figure out where it really goes. Okay, so with that all out of the way, now we can go back to delving into our question, which is, when did we start using these seasonal polar ecosystems for nesting? So currently the oldest evidence for polar bird nesting comes from the Eocene La Meseta Formation of Seymour Island, Antarctica, which was deposited at a paleo latitude of 64 degrees south, so actually just shy of the Paleo-Antarctic Circle. Baby penguin fossils have been identified from the uppermost layers of the formation, the oldest of which date between 40.5 and 46.5 million years old. But even using that oldest age constraint of 46.5 million years for the Lamaceta penguins, this still leaves us with a gap of over 100 million years following the origin of the earliest birds in the late Jurassic. But in order to lessen this gap in our understanding, first we have to calibrate our expectations for when this behavior of seasonal bird nesting reasonably could have originated. So the first kind of obvious one, but investigating the origins of seasonal polar nesting requires identifying a polar formation that was actually experiencing seasonal winter conditions. And if we look at our paleoclimate reconstructions, we kind of know that the late Jurassic and the early Cretaceous are going to be largely unsuitable for this because they were times of globally warm climatic conditions. While there's evidence for brief cold snaps in the early Cretaceous, evidence for sustained global cooling didn't begin until the Turonian about 90 million years ago. But the latitudinal temperature gradient really began to strengthen about 80 million years ago when high latitude regions began cooling very rapidly. Now, this age also happens to agree with the age of that most commonly recovered sister taxon to the crown, Iaseornis, which is often used as a soft maximum to calibrate the age of the origin of Neornithes. Since crown birds are the only birds known to have made it through the end Cretaceous mass extinction and the extinction winter that came with it, we might hypothesize that they're the only birds that actually have the adaptive capabilities to inhabit these seasonal polar environments. As of right now, they're also the only birds we know that have ever done it. So we kind of have this nice little list of what to look for in order to answer our question. We need a Campanian polar formation that experienced seasonal winter conditions. It needs to have the potential to preserve birds, and it needs to have the potential to preserve evidence of nesting. So easy, right? So turns out the Prince Creek Formation of northern Alaska is perfectly positioned to help us answer this question. It's present throughout the north slope of Alaska at a modern day latitude of about 70 degrees north. And it preserves a remarkable dinosaur ecosystem that was deposited during the Campanian an estimated 72.8 million years ago. And Alaska was much further north at this time. So these animals would have been living at a paleolatitude of 80 to 85 degrees north, making the Prince Creek dinosaurs the northernmost dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous. And actually, there are some other high latitude dinosaurs, but the Prince Creek dinosaurs are the only ones known to have experienced seasonal winter conditions. So the Prince Creek is really the only ecosystem we can study to answer our questions. Year-round occupants of the ecosystem would have to endure a cold month mean temperature of just around -2 degrees Celsius, snowfall, and about 4 months of continuous winter darkness. And we know it's cold because a typical Cretaceous ecosystem has a lot of cold-blooded animals, including lizards, snakes, crocodilians, frogs, and turtles. But these animals are actually completely absent from the Prince Creek. And this is probably because if you're dependent on external heat sources, not only do you not want to be living somewhere where the temperatures are below freezing in the winter, you absolutely do not want to be living somewhere where it's dark for 4 months out of the year. So to check back in, we've actually hit 2 of our requirements already. The Prince Creek is 72.8 million years old, and we know that it experienced seasonal winter conditions. So next, we need to know if the Prince Creek has the potential to preserve bird fossils. So the first thing we can do is look at the dinosaurs from the Prince Creek. And currently, there's evidence for at least 13 species of dinosaur from the formation. But the ones that are of the most interest to us are three species of small dromaeosaur, which demonstrates the potential to preserve those delicate theropod bones. So that's a great sign. But even the smallest dromaeosaur is still going to be quite a bit bigger than we would expect our birds to be. So we want to see if we're also preserving the smaller members of the ecosystem. And this is a little bit tricky in this case because a lot of the typical smaller community members would be our frogs and our lizards. But we do still have one other big group we can look to. And that's mammals. So the Prince Creek preserves evidence for at least 4 to 5 species of mammal. So these are portions of the jaw of one of these mammals. It's called Unaacames. And I really want to highlight how teeny tiny these teeth are. That's a complete tooth there. And this mammal was named in 2019, and it's a metatherian. So that group includes all modern marsupials and their fossil relatives. And this fossil actually represents the northernmost occurrence of metatheria ever, including today. So pretty cool. We have another teeny tiny mammal that was only recently described in 2023. These are its little teeth shown here. And it's just about the size of a shrew mouse, or a little guy here. would have weighed about 10 grams, or the weight of about 10 paper clips. So really just itty bitty. So when we look at the Prince Creek as a whole, we know we have small theropod dinosaurs, so that's a great sign. And we have very small mammals, so also a great sign. That makes me feel pretty comfortable saying that, yep, we probably do have the potential to preserve birds if they're there. So the last thing, and probably the trickiest one, is we need to figure out if we have the potential to preserve evidence of nesting. And it just so happens that the Prince Creek preserves an incredible collection of baby dinosaur bones that represents one of the best collections of baby dinosaur material in the world, and has really established the Prince Creek as a globally significant unit for the investigation of dinosaur reproduction. 70% of the dinosaurian families present in the Prince Creek are also represented by baby bones and teeth, which is the highest percentage for any North American Cretaceous formation. And these bones are teeny, teeny, tiny. These are the caudal vertebrae of a couple different species, and that's a literal pinhead for scale, so just tiny. Unfortunately, with all these baby bones, it's really difficult to pin down a taxonomic referral, just given how immature they are. So we thankfully also have lots of baby teeth. And these are generally much easier to identify because dinosaur teeth are usually fairly unique to the given species. And these baby dinosaur teeth actually include some of the smallest teeth ever found in North America. The smallest of which are from perinates, which are animals that are either embryonic or immediately post-hatching. So we're talking very, very young developmentally. So we can go back to our checklist and we can say with a lot of confidence that the Prince Creek is really the perfect place to investigate the origins of seasonal polar bird nesting. The big thing we need now is to actually start finding some birds. And after a careful comparative analysis of thousands of microfossils collected over the span of over a decade, we were able to confidently identify bird fossils from the Prince Creek. This is a bone called the coracoid, so that makes up part of the shoulder girdle, and they're very diagnostic in birds. So we can say with like near confidence that this bone is from a bird. And as it turns out, the Prince Creek has actually produced one of the best collections of late Cretaceous terrestrial bird fossils in the world. We have over 50 three-dimensionally preserved elements that represent every skeletal region and tell us that the Prince Creek was home to a rich Arctic avifauna. So now let's talk about what types of birds were living in the Prince Creek. We hypothesized that the only birds capable of living in a seasonal polar environment would be our crown birds. So were we correct? It looks like it. It's a maybe. The most abundant elements from the Prince Creek assemblage are consistent with a placement either within or just outside the avian crown. We can't really say for sure right now, but if they aren't crown birds, they're coming from the closest relative to crown birds currently known. And it looks like they're representative of at least 2 to 3 species. So despite the extremely limited fossil record for this portion of the bird evolutionary tree, bird fossils from the Prince Creek bear a number of features that would be consistent with being from crown birds. A tibia tarsus preserves a supratendinal bridge. To date, this feature has only been observed in Iaciornis, that's sister to the crown, and crown birds, and is still broadly considered a synapomorphy for the group. We have a nearly complete humerus that bears a deeply defined intercondylar incisure between 2 globose and cranially situated condyles, a uniquely deeply excavated olecranon fossa, and a strongly reduced delta pectoral crest. And we have a dennary that is edentulous and bears a bony mandibular symphysis. So that's another feature that's broadly considered synapomorphic of crown birds. So we can't say anything for sure, but if the fossils from the Prince Creek do come from a crown bird, it would be the oldest crown bird currently recognized by over 4 million years. But even if it's not, and it is just the closest known relative to crown birds, and it's showing us that some very advanced bird characteristics were already present 73 million years ago. And based on our hypothesis, it kind of seems like those advanced characteristics might be a requirement for living in seasonal Arctic ecosystems. But surprise, it turns out the Prince Creek fauna is not only limited to these highly derived birds. We have fossils that indicate the presence of at least 1 species of Ichthyarnithes. Diagnostic morphologies include a manual phalanx 2-1 that preserves an internal index process. This feature is considered synapomorphic for the group. And we have a distal humerus that bears a strong overall resemblance to Ichthyarnis, and then it bears a relatively weak intercondylar incisure between 2 relatively well-developed and distally situated condyles. And we also have at least 1 species of Hesperornithes. A large cervical vertebrate is strongly heterocoelous and bears large pleurocells that are not perforated by pneumatic foramina. Our Hesperornithian is actually our least well-known bird from the Prince Creek, but it's also our largest bird. Most of our birds are within the size of range of a small duck, but this vertebrate is kind of in the goose range, so it's quite a bit bigger. We also have a proximal tibia tarsus that bears a proximally projected cranial menial crest and extremely thickened compacta. Both of these features are also consistent with diving birds. So this material tells us a diversity of birds were living in the Cretaceous Arctic of Alaska, including birds we didn't necessarily think were capable of living in such a challenging environment, because these are the first known toothed birds to be living in a seasonal polar environment. But we haven't just been asking this whole time, when did birds begin living in a seasonal polar environment? We've been asking, when did the birds begin utilizing those environments for breeding? And amazingly, Prince Creek also preserves numerous perinatal bird elements. And again, these are baby birds that are either embryonic or immediately post-hatching. So this provides the oldest evidence for polar bird nesting by at least 26 million years. And while the earliest known growth stages of those more basal and antiornithians are well known, these fossils actually represent the earliest known growth stages of Mesozoic euornithians and are providing new and exciting insights into their development. For instance, these are two perinatal tarsometatarsi, or the foot bone. And while full fusion of the tarsometatarsus has been previously used as an indicator of an adult growth stage for ornithurine birds, our fossils from the Prince Creek are already fully fused distally, despite that extremely small size and extremely porous outer bone texture, indicative of this perinatal growth stage. Now, you may have noticed, okay, we've talked about all the adults now. We've talked about all the babies. And you told us that enantiornithians are the most abundant Mesozoic birds. And we haven't seen any from the Prince Creek yet. Weird, right? And we're actually hypothesizing that this just might be because they're not well enough adapted to live in the Arctic. And there's a number of reasons for this. If you want to live in the Arctic, you really only have two options. You either overwinter or you migrate. There's not really any other option. And either strategy requires a suite of advanced adaptations. We know that the dinosaurs were overwintering because they would have been too young to migrate before the onset of winter due to slow incubation and growth to maturity time. And I want to kind of walk through this using our hadrosaur as an example. So reproduction is unlikely to occur outside of the light months because winter conditions were so severe that results in a reproductive season from March to October. So what's in green there? The incubation for hadrosaurs is estimated to be about 6 months based on growth lines from embryonic teeth. So let's assume they are migratory and the adult hadrosaurs arrive back in the Arctic sometime in mid-March when the first vegetation begins to reappear after the winter. They then need time to actually construct their nests and lay their eggs. So a really quick turnaround would be an incubation start time of April 1st. That means that our hatching times are the end of September. And if they leave around the time of leaf fall, that's mid-October, so not even a month after hatching. Then the babies, these newly hatched babies, only have about 5 months to migrate down and back an estimated 2,000 kilometers, which is a rate of 13 to 14 kilometers a day at only 1 to 6 months old. So we feel pretty confident saying that the dinosaurs were probably overwintering and they just weren't capable of migrating at such young ages. And there's a couple of ways they might have done this. There's a few strategies they might have used. Our mega herbivores, like our hadrosaur, have been hypothesized to have sustained themselves off of low quality forage, including bark and ferns and moss. And our smaller taxa might have hibernated in burrows or other forms of shelter. Our enantiornithians, though, don't appear well adapted to endure harsh winters. And this has actually been hypothesized to have contributed to their extinction during the end Cretaceous impact winter. Some amazing fossils preserved in amber have shown us that they had really unusual molting patterns that may have made them susceptible to sudden changes in temperature. Most modern birds replace only a few of their feathers at a time so that they're still able to fly and they still stay warm. But enantiornithians did something called a simultaneous molt, where basically all their feathers fall out at the same time and they regrow over the span of a couple weeks. So that would have made them very susceptible to those sudden shifts in winter temperature. Modern birds also have something called a gizzard, and most of them will swallow rocks that will sit in the gizzard and kind of grind up their food for them. And we have really good sample sizes of remarkably preserved enantiornithine fossils, including this one, which actually preserves stomach contents. But we have never found an enantiornithine with gizzard stones, even though we found euornithine birds from the same deposits that do have the gizzard stones. So we don't think that they were doing this. A lack of gizzard stones would have severely limited their dietary diversity because they would have had a really hard time digesting tough foods like seeds, which just would have made it really difficult when you have these limited seasonal food resources. So if they couldn't overwinter, right, their only other option is that they have to migrate before the onset of winter, but that doesn't really seem very plausible for them either. Some remarkable baby enantiornithine fossils have been discovered. This one's less than 5 centimeters long, and they've taught us a lot about enantiornithine growth and development. Enantiornithine parents may have just been too heavy to directly incubate their eggs like modern birds, which would result in slower incubation times for their hatchlings. And while their hatchlings are thought to have been capable of flight within the first 24 hours after hatching, they developed pretty slowly and they didn't reach their adult body sizes for a few years, which would have made their long distance migration very difficult for them. Because remember, this is an estimated 2,000 kilometer round trip journey in only 5 months. So while it seems like the dinosaurs were well adapted to overwinter, and the birds living in the Prince Creek seem like they maybe could have done either, enantiornithines don't really seem well adapted to do either, which may have just completely prohibited them from utilizing the Arctic ecosystem. Okay, we've talked about a lot today, so to kind of recap, not only do these fossils represent the earliest evidence of polar nesting by at least 26 million years, they also represent the first evidence of this behavior in the Mesozoic and in a non-neornithine bird. So this holds immense ramifications for avian evolution. Birds and their newly hatched offspring would either have to endure adverse winter conditions or migrate more than 2,000 kilometers to more equable conditions at lower latitudes, which would indicate the evolution of advanced flight adaptations and navigational abilities. But these adaptive hurdles did not impede birds from utilizing the ecosystem. This remarkable assemblage of bird fossils demonstrates to us that a diverse fauna of birds nested alongside non-avian dinosaurs in the Cretaceous Arctic of Alaska. They would have benefited from an extreme high latitude summer light regime with about 6 months of continuous daylight, which likely came with many of those added benefits that still draw extant birds to modern polar ecosystems nearly 73 million years later. So now that I've hopefully convinced you that the fossils coming from the Prince Creek are some of the most exciting in the world, I want to spend the time I have left kind of talking about the immense amount of work that goes into making these discoveries. So the paleontologists at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Museum of the North have put an incredible amount of work into understanding Arctic dinosaurs and the broader Prince Creek ecosystem. And the first step to doing this is to actually go and find those fossils. The first thing that makes Alaska different from places like Montana and Colorado is that it's gigantic. If you cut it in half, Texas would still only be the 3rd largest state in the US. And that inherently just makes it more difficult to do field work because you have to actually get places. And remember, the Prince Creek Formation is located at 70 degrees latitude on the north slope of Alaska, which is about 500 miles from Fairbanks, where the museum is. So given where we are, when you guys hear late Cretaceous formation, and especially late Cretaceous dinosaur-bearing formation, something like this is probably popping into your head, right? And that's totally fair. And you get a ton of cool dinosaur fossils from there. So that's probably also what the north slope of Alaska looks like, right? If we're getting all these cool dinosaur fossils, not so much. So most of the north slope is tundra, and all the rock is unfortunately buried under all that tundra. Thankfully, the Colville River helped us out a little, and it carved through some of the tundra, exposing some of the rock along these river bluffs. There are a few other locations with poor exposure, but this is by far the most extensive, and it's produced all the fossil material currently known from the Prince Creek Formation. Historically, fossil material has come from one of 2 bone beds. We have the Liscombe bone bed on the left or the Kekak-Tagosiak on the right. And these are both highly monospecific bone beds, meaning they really only produce one type of dinosaur. The Liscombe bone bed has primarily produced agernolic fossils, and they're mostly immature animals, so it's been interpreted as a mass die-off of these younger dinosaurs when they failed to complete a river crossing, so it's kind of brutal. And the Kekak-Tagosiak has produced primarily Pachyrhinosaurus material with a little bit of Nanuqsaurus thrown in there too as well. But there was a while where it kind of seemed like These two sites were it for the Prince Creek dinosaurs. They hadn't really found much else, and there weren't any obvious new sites anywhere. But so more recently, the Museum of the North really made an effort to look for new sites, and they found that most of the potential might actually be in these microsites. And so those are the deposits that preserve these very small fossils. And thanks to their efforts, some of the most exciting Prince Creek discoveries have come from one of 4 of these microsites that they found only in the last decade. And they've really given us a remarkable look into the smaller members of the community. But collecting and processing these microsites has been a very long labor of love. In the 3 years I was at UAF for my master's, I got to tag along to the Prince Creek twice. And the first time I got to do this was in the winter. So that's me in that absolutely gigantic red coat. And this is actually only the second time they had ever done this. So there's one main highway that connects Fairbanks to a town on the North Slope called Dead Horse. It's called the Dalton Highway. If you've ever seen ice road truckers, it's that road that they call the most dangerous highway in America. It was fine. But again, that's about a 500-mile drive. Once we get up there, we got permission to use the roads that oil companies make to go check on their plots. And they maintain those in the winter, so we're able to get really close to the site just by driving. After that, because the river's also frozen over, we can actually snow machine right over the river and out to camp. And at the campsite, we're sleeping in tents with wood-burning stoves, so hopefully you can see the little stovepipes sticking out the top. And that photo's on the left on what it looks like on the inside. And we've got a pot on top of the stove for melting snow for drinking water. And that photo on the right is the view from just outside my tent. So those big yellow tubs are bear-proof containers for food, and hopefully for obvious reasons, we keep those outside the tent and far away. And then it's just time for us to get to work. So we were doing this in early April, so we were getting about 6 hours of daylight at this point in the year, so it's a very limited work window, and it's cold. We dealt with temperatures down to -30, and I actually got off pretty easy because I wasn't around yet for the first time they did this, where they were dealing down to -50. And obviously doing this is insane, so why are we doing this in the winter, and why did they go back a second time? With this particular site, which we call Ojsaurus, it's just too unsafe to work in the summer. The rock in this area is all permafrost, so the exposed rock thaws and freezes each year. This is what it looks like in the summer. So all the overlying rock that's kind of above that blue tarp in the middle is thawing and is at risk of just falling on our heads in the summer. So that's obviously not ideal. But in the winter, it's totally frozen. So we can use all the power tools we want, and we don't have to worry about any rock falls. It just also means that we have to wear these silly coats the whole time. But it's totally worth it because this site is actually unique for a couple reasons. Unlike the more traditional microsites, it's kind of weird because it's not only preserving all those tiny bones and teeth that we like to see, but for some reason it's also preserving a lot of bigger elements, including adult hadrosaur material, which is actually fairly rare because our big hadrosaur deposit is mostly immature dinosaurs. And it also, for some reason, has a higher concentration of rarer fossils, including our small theropod dinosaurs and our mammals and our birds. So that's why we're willing to put ourselves through all this for just this one site. But because the rock is frozen, it's not as simple as just shoveling the rock into buckets and, kind of collecting the sediment from the bone layer. So instead, we cut out big blocks with jackhammers and chisels and chainsaws, and it takes forever. And then these blocks go back to the museum where we actually plaster jacket them and then just let them thaw. And then once they thawed, it's just this nice loose sediment that we can kind of excavate in the lab like you typically would in the field. And even though we do all that crazy winter fieldwork for that site, we do still do fieldwork in the summer as well. But that does not make it simple at all. Because remember how in the winter we have all those nice snow roads that we can use to get out to the site and the river's frozen over so we can snow machine out? So step one in the summer is we're taking a very little plane out to an airstrip along the Colville River. And that does mean it's a lot faster because it's only about a 2-hour flight instead of a 2-day drive. And we land in this little town called Umiat, which is this cool old naval town from the 60s when they were exploring the National Petroleum Reserve, and they still kind of use it as a staging area for researchers. And it's glorious. The next step is we have to get our absurd amount of gear and people out to the river. And then we actually have to get our boats set up and figure out how to load everything so that it doesn't fall out into the river. And we were very fortunate this day because it's probably the sunniest day ever experienced along the Colville River. So don't get used to these photos with blue skies. And then we just get floating down the river, and it's about a 2-day trip until we get to our field area. So I said it's a lot faster up than in the winter, but it really about evens out with the time it takes us to float down to the site. And this is actually the same exact spot that we camped in the winter. So you can see it looks a lot different from the campsite photo I showed earlier. And our main goal of this trip was to open a microsite that we called Jacob's Bed because it'd been producing a ton of cool stuff. So we wanted to go and re-find it. So keep this before photo in mind because everyone's standing at about the bone layer, which of course is about halfway down this hill. So we have to get all of that stuff out of the way before we can actually get the stuff we want to look at. So you can't run away to the Arctic to escape overburden. It follows you everywhere. And this isn't as straightforward as just digging because remember, all of this is permafrost. So the outermost stuff is thawed, but it doesn't take very long before we started hitting ice again. And it took us about a full week to dig, not that much. But we did eventually get there. And I don't really have any cool photos of fossils to show you in the field because this is a microsite. So we just shovel sediment into buckets and all the processing gets done back at the lab. So instead of showing you dead animals for once, I'm going to quickly show you some of our fun wildlife encounters. So this is a muskox that rounded into our camp at 5 a.m. And I had woken up to pee and unzipped my tent and saw a fuzzy brown blob. So I think a lot of you can see probably where my brain was at when I was groggy first thing in the morning. Thankfully, it wasn't a bear. It was just this very cute little muskox, and I was the only one who got to see it. So we also had a fox who was very confused as to why we were digging a big hole in the hill. So he supervised most of our excavation. We named him Corn Nut, and he was probably actually the most helpful member of the crew. He kept us in line. So once we get the insane amount of dirt we dug up back to the museum, this is the fun part because when it comes to microsites, this is where we're actually making all of our cool discoveries. Step one before we can look at the fossils though is washing the dirt, and we actually use Dawn dish soap, so it's good for both living and fossil baby birds. And I unfortunately don't really have many pictures of this just because it's not that exciting. It's washing dirt with soap and water, so that's really all it is. But once it is washed and dried, we're ready to check it for microfossils. So nearly all the fossils I talked about today, I owe to volunteers across multiple institutions who have sat and done the very glamorous job of micropicking for hours on end. I do not have the temperament for this. But it's basically the process of looking through each grain of sediment and pulling out anything that looks interesting. And that's what's happening here. So on the right, there's just a small scoop of this sediment. And you basically just look at every single grain individually under the microscope, and it takes a really long time. All the grains here are under 2 millimeters, but we also have a fraction that we look at where everything's under 0.5 millimeter. So it takes an absurdly long time to look through everything. But that rigorous processing is why, despite our very challenging field conditions and despite our limited exposure relative to lower latitude fossil sites, we really have this incredible collection for the Prince Creek dinosaurs. So I hope that after all of that, you guys will agree with me when I say that Alaskan dinosaurs are some of the most interesting in the world. And all of this incredibly challenging work is absolutely worth it. And with that, I do just want to there's so many people to thank, but I really want to acknowledge my co-authors on this study. I am super excited to announce that this work's been accepted for publication in the journal Science. It'll hopefully be out in the next couple months. So if you're interested, keep your eyes peeled. Again, hopefully sometime in the next couple months.